So, Michael, let's start at the beginning. How did you first come across this story? And what made you actually want to take another look at the case of Robert Farquharson?
Well, I was dealing with a guy called Luke McMahon, who was a law student, but also doing some freelance journalism on the side. And he was doing some investigative work for me. I was an editor. And out of the blue, he sends me this text message saying, I think Robert Farquharson's innocent. And my response was basically, no, I don't think so. And he said, sit down with me for an hour and I'll convince you. And I did talk to him. That was 8 years ago. I talked to him many times over the course of the following years. But eventually this year I thought, right, let's get to the bottom of this. I did sit down for that hour with him, and we went through the strands of evidence in the case. And I thought, look, this is worth a look. This is worth a serious piece of journalism, and that's what I embarked on.
And why were you so skeptical? Why was your first instinct to be like, nah, mate, I don't think so?
Well, this was a case that was litigated through the courts twice. Two juries have found Robert Farquharson guilty. Two appeal courts have, in essence, backed up the ability of the juries to find those facts. And so, like most people, I think, having seen it go through that process, we have what's called the principle of finality here. In the legal system, once it's done, it's done. It's final, it's over. We remove the word alleged from the word murderer in our news stories and so forth. And it's done and dusted. And we need that to sort of move on as a society and to accept that a finding of fact has been made. And so I was like that. And I think most of us are like that. And so we should be, and so we can be most of the time. But we know from overseas examples that miscarriages of justice do occur. But there's also been some infamous cases here. There's obviously the Lindy Chamberlain case where she was convicted and jailed for killing baby Azaria, but it turns out a dingo took the baby. And the more recent case of Kathleen Folbig, whose convictions for murder and manslaughter of her four children were recently quashed. I guess I've approached it somewhat reluctantly, but to really test that thesis.
Okay, so before we get into your investigation, can you please tell me about what actually happened on that night of Father's Day in 2005?
So on that day, Robert Farquharson had agreed with his wife, Cindy Gambino, that he would take the children for dinner. He'd been to work in the morning. She dropped them over at about 3 p.m. The little one, Bailey, who was only 2, reaches up and asks and says, "Cuddle, Mum," and that's the last she knows of any of them. They get in the car, or they watch the footy a little bit. They get in the car. They drive the half hour or so to Geelong from their home in Winchelsea, which is southwest of Melbourne. They arrive there. Bailey's fallen asleep in the back of the car, so they sit in the car park there in Kmart in Geelong, listening to the footy for a little bit, and then they go do a bit of shopping for some cricket gear. They don't buy anything though. Then they go off to the KFC and have dinner. Robert has agreed to bring them back by 7:30 that night, and so Jay, the 10-year-old, he gets in the front seat. Tyler, who's 7, gets in his little seat, and Bailey, who's 2, is strapped into his baby seat, and they drive back to Winchelsea. They stopped there a couple of stops along the way. They stopped to buy a video at Kmart. They drop in to see Robert Farquharson's sister, and then they drive towards Winchelsea. A few kilometres outside of Winchelsea, there's a dam. It's a very deep dam, and the car leaves the road, goes into the dam. Robert Farquharson opens the door and gets out of the car to try and help. He says to try and go around and help the children out. He says he doesn't know that he's in a dam, and the car sinks. Now, the reason he says he doesn't know that he's in a dam is because he says he had a coughing fit, and he's been coughing for weeks before that. And he had a coughing fit and passed out. It's a condition called cough syncope. And he says, I was coughing on the overpass leading up to the dam. I woke up and the car's still. I don't know where I am. He says Jay opens the front passenger door to try and get out, but water comes in, so Robert quickly closes it and thinks, well, I better we might be on the side of the road in a ditch, we might be in a few feet of water, I'll go help the kids out. So he opens his door to go around, and by the time he surfaces from this 7-metre dam, the car's basically gone. That's his story. Then he swims to the road and seeks help.
Which brings me to my next question, which is that this case very quickly turned from people thinking this was just some sort of horrific, tragic accident to actually believing that this was cold-blooded murder. So why was that?
Well, really it came down to Robert Farquharson's behaviour in the minutes and hours after the crash. He swam to the side. Once he swam to the side of the dam, he flagged down a car, but instead of asking for 000 to be called or taking up the offer of those young men to jump in the dam and look for his children, he said, "Take me to Cindy's. I've just killed my kids." And then he goes to Cindy's. He tells her, "I've killed the kids. They've drowned." They go back to the dam. Cindy's in a panic, and you can hear the panic in her voice in the 000 call that she ultimately makes. And while other people are diving into the dam and looking for them, Robert Farquharson is standing on the bank asking people for cigarettes and smoking cigarettes. The police, when they interview him in the hospital afterwards, they ask him a number of questions, and his preoccupation seems to be, what's the scenario for me? He asks that a couple of times. The police quickly form the view that he's self-focused. He's worried about what's going to happen to him, that he's not worried about the children. They say in their notebooks, he doesn't seem very emotional, no tears. And they're also immediately skeptical of his coughing and passing out story. So very quickly on that night, the events in the police minds are starting to turn from the idea that this is a tragic accident to that this might be murder.
So, Michael, what did Robert Farquharson's ex-wife, Cindy Gambino, think had happened? Did she actually think that he had done this to their children?
Well, Cindy's another tragic aspect of this story. She died a couple of years ago after what's described as a medical episode on Mother's Day in 2022. She was only 50 years old. So the ramifications of this have been awful throughout. But initially, she did believe him. We've got in the podcast, we've got phone taps where she's speaking very warmly to him in the days and weeks after the crash. In the committal and the first trial, she gave evidence essentially on his behalf. And in an interview after he's found guilty in the first trial, she says to the interviewer, she wants him to be free. She still believes he's innocent. The jury doesn't know who he is. I know who he is, and he's the only person I would have trusted unconditionally with the children. Cindy supported him really in every way she could. But that changed. After he was released on appeal after the first trial and a retrial was ordered, a new witness came forward, a woman called Dawn Waite, and her evidence finally convinced Cindy that her ex-husband had done it, and in the second trial she gave evidence against him.
And specifically, that evidence was this woman, Dawn Waite. She says she actually had driven in front of Robert Farquharson's car, I believe, on the night that this happened, and she gave evidence that he wasn't coughing, I believe. Is that sort of what really was so convincing to Cindy Gambino?
So until Dawn Waite came forward, there'd been no eyewitnesses whatsoever. The first people who knew about this were people that he flagged down on the road after the event. Dawn says that she was coming back from Geelong to her house in Warrnambool. She drove up behind him. He was driving erratically but very slowly. She could see things through the back window. Then she overtakes him and she can see more things through the side window, specifically that he looks well, he's not coughing, he's looking out to the right of the car. It's suggested strongly that he's looking for the exit of the road to steer off to the dam. And then she overtakes him and drives past. And in her rear vision mirror, she says she sees the car veer off the road and presumably into the dam. So that was, really the only eyewitness evidence that came forward in the trial. And that was enough for Cindy to say that was the clincher, she said.
And so this case had a very long journey through the courts. There was 2 trials, there was various appeals. Can you tell me about that and what the case against Robert Farquharson actually ended up resting on?
That's not a simple answer. It's what's called a strands of the rope case, and that's a legal term, but a great metaphor, I think. No single strand of evidence, in all likelihood, would have been strong enough to convict him, but woven together, they make a rope that is strong enough. But each individual strand is circumstantial. So there's the dawn weight evidence. We're calling that in our analysis, we're calling that strand 5. The demeanour evidence, which I've mentioned, is one of the strands, just people's judgments about his character. But then there was another strand was how the car got from the road to the dam. He says he coughed and passed out and has no memory of that, and the car essentially veered off the road while he was unconscious, and he woke up in the dam. That's what he said. So the police tried to work out, well, what did happen in that 2.9 seconds between the road and the dam? Then they tried to work out, could he have had cough syncope? And they produced an expert to say that he couldn't have had. Then there was another witness, Greg King, a friend of his, who said that he had met him 3 months before at the fish and chip shop, and that Farquharson had essentially outlined his murder plot at that point in advance. And so sort of each of these strands all woven together was the police case. And so I guess to kind of really analyse this case, what you have to do and what we've done, what we've tried to do, is to look at each of those strands and to try to see, does it stand up to scrutiny? Is it as the police suggested in the prosecution, and therefore can the rope sustain a conviction beyond reasonable doubt?
Michael, tell me about some of the concerns that experts you've spoken to have raised about the Farquharson case. What have you found through the course of your investigation?
We found that there are serious questions to answer about each of the strands on the scientific evidence, but also on the witness evidence. And we're not alone. The Australian Academy of Science Chief Executive, Anna Maria Arabia, who was quite central, I think, in mustering the fresh science that helped Folbig get past that hurdle and get released.
Just to remind listeners, that's Kathleen Folbig, the New South Wales woman who was convicted of the killing of 4 of her children, and she was recently released from prison and had her conviction quashed.
That's right. So the Australian Academy of Science played a role there, and they've also had a look at this case, and they have similar disquiets about some of the evidence. So, for example, one of the strands, which I didn't mention earlier, is how does a car sink in a dam? And the police did an experiment to try and prove this. They didn't know either. So a month or so after the crash, they did their own experiment. The problem was twofold, really. They put a car into a shallow dam. It was 2.8 metres deep. The car was a lot longer, more than 4.5 metres long. And the dam that Farquharson sank in was 7.4 metres deep, well and truly enough to encompass the whole car lengthwise. In fact, the car was found nose down at the bottom of the dam. That fundamentally changes the physics of how a car sinks. Now, the police say, well, we didn't really do it to see how it would sink. We did it to test his story that he could get out of the car, that he could open the door and get out of the car. And it turns out you can. The diver did it in the police experiment, and he could. But then on the banks of the dam, they put on an experiment where they leave the doors closed and the car just sits there. And after about 3 minutes, the front of the car hits the bottom of the dam, and it sits there for another 5 minutes before it finally subsides gently back into the dam. Now, that was played to the jury, and you might ask, how's that possible? It's not an accurate experiment. It's not an accurate reflection. And yet 2 juries were shown that. And in her book about this case, Helen Garner, she writes very persuasively about how devastating that was to the defence, because, of course, the jury and everybody in the courtroom is sitting there imagining themselves to be the children as the water slowly creeps up the car, and there's cameras inside the car in this police experiment. So we've spoken to an expert who says that's just misleading, wrong, false. That's not how a car would behave. And he an Canadian guy called Gordon Giesbrecht, who has sunk cars in deep water and opened the door, and it's gone in seconds. So the police thesis was Farquharson had time. He had time to get the children out. Giesbrecht's experiment shows us that that's just not the case.
I mean, I have to say this was one of the most jaw-dropping moments that I read in your feature that appeared in The Good Weekend over the weekend, because it's such a stark difference. The difference between the police video, which shows that it takes almost 8 minutes for the car to sink. So, of course, people are imagining these poor children trapped inside. And then your Canadian expert who did his version of the experiment, and it takes only 10 seconds, which is a totally different scenario, isn't it, in terms of what chance Farquharson, if this is true, would have had to get his children out.
Well, that's right. And we know that it was a deep dam, and we know that he got out of the car and he got out the door because all the windows were closed. So we know those two things for a fact. And from that, we know how the car would have sunk. And so to suggest, as the police did, that he could have got the kids, marshalled the kids, made a plan, organised them, got them out is fanciful. And that's one strand. In one sense, because Gordon Giesbrecht didn't do those experiments till 2014, that to some extent is fresh evidence that the police didn't know and perhaps couldn't have known, but which could play into any future appeal.
And so among the people concerned about Farquharson's conviction is the woman that you've mentioned before, Anna Maria Arabia. She heads up this Australian Academy of Science, which is a very reputable organization here. Now, you've spoken to her at length, so can you tell me about some of the issues that she sees with the case and what she's now calling for?
Yes, Anna Maria sees issues with that piece of evidence that I've just spoken about, but others as well. For example, the police wanted to know, is it possible to cough and pass out? It turns out, there's global experts who suggest that it is. There's questions about the evidence that the police produced and the prosecution used about how the car got from the road to the dam and so forth. So what she's really saying is that the experts who give opinion in court cases are very influential. They're the only ones in a case who are allowed to express an opinion. Everybody else can just say, this is what I saw. But experts can express an opinion, and they need to be qualified to do it. Her argument is that in Australia, the selection of them is not sufficient, that they are, in fact, as it stands, they are chosen by the prosecution to support their case or by the defence to support their case. She's saying we need the best experts with the best expertise to be informing juries. So that's one thing. Then the evidence that they themselves give, what's called sorry, I'll start that again. Secondly, the evidence that they actually give, she says, should be subject to what's called a reliability standard. It needs to be more than just an opinion. It needs to be reliable, and so that juries can, so that we're not introducing junk science into court. She says in the Australian system at the moment, junk science is too easily allowed into courts. And the third thing she wants is a kind of a post-appeal review mechanism that's outside the court system, which can look at cases like this where there are questions raised about the quality of the evidence, run it by the experts, see if there might be doubt, and either remit it to the courts or do something else with it, provide advice, scientific expert advice, because obviously the courts, once that finality principles come into play and it's done and dusted, your ability to go back and revisit your case is very limited.
Now, I want to turn to the appeal that you mentioned earlier. Robert Farquharson's new lawyer, Luke McMahon, he plans on lodging one later this year. So on what grounds will he actually be appealing this conviction?
Well, Luke is the journalist that I spoke to all those years ago initially. He was a law student then. He became kind of obsessed with the case. And a year or so ago, he signed up Robert Farquharson as his client. And he is launching an appeal later this year. So again, it will be on these strands of evidence. I think Luke thinks possibly the strongest of the fresh and compelling evidence he's got is what we just spoke about with the car sinking and Gordon Giesbrecht's experiments. But that fresh and compelling is the legal test to even get over the threshold to get a new appeal. And that's a very high bar. It can't be fresh or compelling. It must be fresh and compelling. So he has to find evidence that wasn't presented at either of the two trials, and that it needs to be compelling enough to have the court come back and have another look. So can he get there? I don't know. That's not for me to decide, but it certainly is a high bar. And it's worth remembering also, and this plays into what Anna Maria Arabia is saying about the post-appeal review mechanism, is that very often, as in Farquharson's case, somebody's in jail. They can't afford a lawyer. They can't organise a lawyer to do this for them. It's really only because Luke McMahon has become obsessed by the case and he's working pro bono, he's working for free, that this is even getting to this point. It's very difficult in the Australian system to find a way to challenge your conviction in this way.
And you referred there just a little while back to having a sense of whether this appeal is likely to meet that bar of, requiring fresh and compelling evidence. What do you think the likelihood is that Robert Farquharson's conviction will be overturned?
Well, it needs to be fresh and compelling to even get before the court, and then the court will do what it does. I don't know. I can't answer that question, but I can say that in the case of Kathleen Folbig, which we mentioned earlier, that it took several bites at the cherry for her to finally be released. There was after her appeals were exhausted, after she appealed to the High Court and was rejected for that. There was one commission of inquiry which found even more convincingly that she was guilty, and then a second commission of inquiry, which is a political action. The Attorney General ordered that commission, finally got the right experts in front of it, got the right advice, and quashed the conviction. So it's not. There's no guarantees here.
And I mean, she was pardoned. Her conviction wasn't overturned. So I guess we're looking a long way down the track, but I guess that is a possibility in the Farquharson case.
I guess that is a possibility too. But look, I'm just a journalist. I'm just looking at the evidence in the best way I can and finding that I've got my doubts about it. But the courts ultimately and the authorities will decide, has this case against him been proven beyond reasonable doubt, or is there reasonable doubt here? And I guess that's the test throughout the justice system.
Finally, Michael, I want to ask another question about your motivation, why you decided to take this story on in the first place. You mentioned it had been, brought up to you some 8 years ago. It's been a long time now. So this case was obviously so tragic, so horrific, and I imagine reviving the case would be very tough for some people in Robert Farquharson's family. So did you have any reservations about taking on this story?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to start by saying that we find ourselves in the middle of a kind of a male violence crisis at the moment. And to be raising these questions at this time might seem to some to be quite almost the wrong time to do it, or almost offensive. And I'm very aware of that, actually. But also, if there's a guy who tragically, through misadventure and accidents, found himself in the driver's seat when his 3 beloved sons died, is serving a 33-year sentence for that, compounding his own grief with the awesome power of the state to remove his liberty. I find that question a compelling question, and one that should be looked at, and a very a journalistic endeavour to try and find the answer to that. It might not satisfy some people. I know there's still a lot of anger about this case, and a feeling of real tragedy surrounding it, and I totally understand that. I feel it myself. And I think listening to some of the material we've got in our podcast will just show that incredibly graphically to people. But I can't ignore the real questions, I believe, that surround the liberty of this man. And if he is innocent, then I think that story needs to be explored as well.
Well, it's obviously a very tough subject. It's a very horrific case, but we're lucky you've looked into it. So thank you so much, Michael, for your time.
Thanks very much, Samantha.